Stafford, Brandon is coming in with some more water. And also Haley and Nellie from the Progressive Caucus that helped a huge amount of the logistics of all this. And I'd just like to explain a little bit the reason for being of this briefing, which is that there's a unique opportunity at the moment. The Latin American Studies Association is having their annual Congress here in Washington, D.C., which I understand doesn't happen all that often. So that association, LASA, is the biggest association of Latin American experts and scholars. I think they number over 6,000. And they are having, over the next 3 days, a conference in the Marriott Hotel over near the Woodley Park Metro. And we wanted to bring a small sample of Latin America experts here to talk about some policy issues. First of all, because you can't go there unless you're a member of LASA, unfortunately, and the membership fee is rather steep. And secondly, because obviously it's easier for you to come to us if we are right in the Longworth office building. So just quickly, a couple of words on my organization, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and Mark Weisbrot, the co-director, will be joining us very soon. You may know some of our work on domestic issues like Social Security, countering some of the austerity policies, and good jobs versus bad jobs, and so on. But we also do a lot of work on Latin American economies, and also on the impact of economic developments in Latin America on politics. And there's been a huge amount of political change in Latin America over the last 10 years. It's something that has largely not really been on the radar of either the major media in the U.S. or the policy world. But here we have folks today that can talk to you about some of those developments. Really, I think there are two broad themes that we're going to discuss today. First of all, with Laura Carlson and John Lindsay Poland, we're going to discuss U.S. security policy, drug policy, the impact of that in terms of human rights and democracy, mostly focused on Central America and Colombia. And then we're going to talk about the broad theme of the U.S. response to the leftward shift that's taken place throughout Latin America, mostly in South America. So we are going to start, we agreed that we're going to start with Miguel. Is that fine? So we're going to start with Miguel Tinker-Salas. I think he's going to discuss U.S. policy towards these left-leaning governments and how it's been a continuation of the Cold War approach of the past. Miguel is a professor of Latin American history and a Chicano-Latino studies at Pomona College in Claremont, California. His expertise includes contemporary Latin America, society and politics in Venezuela and Mexico, oil, culture and politics in Venezuela, the drug war in Mexico, Mexican border society, and a number of other issues. And he's the author and editor of books such as The Enduring Legacy, Oil Culture and Citizenship in Venezuela, and also Mexico 2006-2012, Neoliberalism, Movimientos Sociales y Política Electoral, Social Movements and Electoral Policy. Miguel?
Buenos días, good morning. Thank you for coming, taking time out of your busy schedule. It kind of feels like in Latin America right now with the heat outside. It's like the same kind of tropical environment. It's interesting how we resonate in many ways. Actually, I was in Caracas last week, and it's actually cooler in Caracas than it is right now in DC. So that's an interesting point of departure. So as Alex said, I'm going to touch upon and argue against some of the conventional wisdoms you might have been hearing about U.S. foreign policy. Largely as the U.S. has been occupied somehow with Iraq, Afghanistan, the global war on terror, or the economic crisis at home, to be overly concerned with Latin America. And according to this perspective, the U.S. has largely been reacting to changes as they occur rather than initiating or maintaining a coherent policy. As importantly, according to this rather, I would say, paternalistic perspective, Latin America, long accustomed to U.S. initiatives, has resented the lack of interest and clamored for Washington to re-engage with the region. I want to hopefully dissuade you from this perspective. The 2 points that I would like to make in this very brief presentation is the first, that the U.S. has been very much connected with Latin America during the Bush and now Obama administration. And rather than being disconnected, they have been in fact pursuing policies that continue to draw from a perspective and experience of the Cold War, viewing Latin America from a perspective of friend or foe mentality, this binary that was so clear during the Cold War, reflecting policies that are largely out of touch with the dominant trends in the region over the last 20 years. And second, contrary to what is promoted by some in the State Department or critically reported in the media, Latin America has not been idly sitting by waiting for the U.S. to re-engage with the region. Over the past decade, the issue has not been the U.S.'s lack of engagement with Latin America, but rather the character of that engagement at a time when Latin America is undergoing tremendous political and cultural change. The Bush-era policy of Cold War containment around Cuba and subsequently Venezuela, where according to then Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, the U.S. sought to inoculate Latin America from radical change, has been continued and in some cases intensified by the Obama administration. Support by the Bush administration for the short-lived coup in Venezuela in 2002 and Haiti in 2004 has been followed under Obama by support for a military coup in Honduras in 2009 and subsequently the acquiescence of a congressional coup in Paraguay in 2012. Similarly, when Bush promoted the free trade for the Americas that was roundly defeated at the Mar del Plata summit in Argentina in 2005, the Obama administration has opted for a policy of separate trade agreements with Peru, Colombia, and Panama, countries that along with Chile and Mexico are today part of the Pacific Alliance and are being drawn into the Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, which aims not only to pivot towards China, but also as part of its policy to undermine the changes in Latin America, the inter-American institutions, and trade alliances such as Mercosur. The other element that can be best described as containment policy has been an increase in the military presence of the U.S. in the region, with reactivation under Bush of the U.S. Naval Fourth Fleet, the naval exercises in the Caribbean against a supposed oil-rich country, you can read into that as you wish, bases in Central America and the Caribbean, a military presence in Colombia and Mexico, and recent military operations in the Strait of Darien at the same time that Obama was visiting Central America. The application of this policy at a time when people in the continent are freely electing progressive and leftist leaders in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere simply increases U.S. isolation. These Cold War practices have found expression and continued support for Plan Colombia at a time when the government of that country is negotiating a peace agreement with the insurgents, and continued support for what has been largely described as a failed drug policy in Mexico and Central America that has left over 70,000 dead, thousands more displaced, and others thousands disappeared. And at a time when governments throughout the region, including close U.S. allies after Colombia, are proposing an alternative to these failed policies. Much as the U.S. insistence on the Cuban embargo and its failed drug policy have led to U.S. complete isolation on this matter, as evidenced in the 6th Summit of the Americas in Colombia, any proposed efforts to continue a policy of isolation towards Cuba or of not recognizing electoral results in Venezuela will only further distance the U.S. from the countries in Latin America. The lack of critical and objective media reporting on these issues also increases U.S. isolation. I would submit that if the U.S. press were your only source of information for what is happening in Latin America, you would be ill-prepared to understand what has transpired in Latin America in the past 15 years. This point was driven home to me when a reporter called and asked me to explain how is it that the Latin American countries could have immediately recognized the electoral victory in Venezuela by Nicolás Maduro when the U.S. had not supported it and called for a recount. The reporter simply could not understand. He could understand how is it that the countries had broken from the perspective of the U.S. on this issue. He failed to understand the dramatic changes in the past 14 years and was simply uncritically echoing the position held by the State Department. And therein lies part of the problem, an uncritical acceptance, a failure to challenge the conventional wisdom and to understand by the media how the region has changed. This perspective flows from a perception that continues to view Latin America as our backyard, a comment we heard recently from Secretary of State Kerry, and refuses to acknowledge the decade-longs of change. Since 1998, Latin America has experienced profound political, economic, and cultural change, electing progressive and openly leftist leaders, dramatically reducing poverty, asserting new rights for people and for the environment, while at the same time reaffirming a new sense of Latin American identity and pride not previously seen since the 1930s and 1940s. In the past 14 years, Latin American nations have forged new inter-American relationships, as evidenced in the founding of the Union of South American Nations, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Countries, and the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. They have grappled with and resolved inter-American issues, including boundary disputes, sovereignty issues, without including the U.S., which used to be the arbiter in such disputes. Beyond these groundbreaking inter-American organizations, Latin Americans have also forged new ties with Europe, as was evidenced by the presence of Prime Minister Angela Merkel at the January meeting of the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, in Santiago, Chile, a meeting that, by the way, unanimously elected Raúl Castro as the president of the CELAC. When asked about the election of Castro, President Santos of Colombia said, "It's a clear message to the U.S. to end the embargo." China has also become a major trading partner, and delegations that usually used to reflect a U.S. presence in the region now include the Chinese, such as the visit of the Chinese Vice President to Venezuela in the last week. Latin American nations have also forged new relations with Arab and Middle Eastern countries, as well as Africa, hosting regular summits between these once disconnected regions. Venezuela and Brazil today have more embassies in Africa than ever before in their history. Brazil over 19, and Venezuela 1 in nearly every country. The fact that Brazil recently forgave close to $1 billion in debt to the African countries speaks to the new assertion of Latin America on the world stage, that a situation that the U.S. unfortunately finds troubling. On the surface, recent trip by Obama to Mexico seems to highlight the fact of the disconnect, and also the discussion by Kerry in the House committee meeting, and we refer to Latin America as backyard. And more importantly than referring to Latin America as backyard is that he simply didn't know where President Obama was going. He knew he was going to Mexico, but then he said the countries of south of the region. He didn't know where he was going. That's troubling. I can't imagine a Secretary of State not knowing that someone is going to France, not to Europe, or to China, not to Asia. And again, it reflects the notion of Latin America as a backyard, and reflects the notion, in many ways, of still pursuing a policy that reflected the notion of trying to inoculate Latin America against changes, when in reality these changes have already taken place. I think we stand at a very important chance for change in the region. As I was saying before, Latin America is not the U.S.'s backyard. It's not going back. The changes have been fundamental in the region, and the U.S. cannot simply continue to operate as if Latin America was still an area of friends and enemies employing the old Cold War mentality. And let me reiterate that the issue has not been the U.S.'s lack of engagement, but rather the kind of engagement that the U.S. has had with Latin America, and that is what the majority of Latin Americans have objected to. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Miguel covered a lot of ground there, and she would agree. And we're going to have a Q&A session after this, so you can follow up on some of the things that have been thrown out there. I've heard a lot about some of the integration plans of the last 10 years, such as UNASUR and CELAC, and how those regional bodies are now engaging with other parts of the world, but not so much with the U.S. And of course, you've heard about how just generally dynamic the region has been, and how really undynamic the U.S. policy has been. It's remained really fairly stagnant over the last decade. So to continue along with this theme of the U.S. response to the leftward shift in Latin America, Mark Weisbrot is going to speak next. So Mark is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, and and has written numerous research papers on economic policy, especially on Latin America and on international economic policy. He is the co-author with Dean Baker of Social Security, the Phony Crisis, and has a weekly column in Guardian Unlimited, and has frequently published opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and in different papers around the world, like Folha de Sao Paulo in Brazil. He is also president of Just Foreign Policy.
Thanks. I want to thank everybody. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And it's great to be here with a great panel. And like Miguel's overview, and what I'm going to do is, and you can find any more of this on our web, more detail at cepr.net. And I want to fill in some more detail on some of the things that Miguel mentioned, because I think things have gotten worse in terms of U.S. policy most recently. And so I think it's important to look at some of the detail, and then, I don't know, talk a little bit about why it matters to anybody who's involved with Congress, and maybe what Congress might be able to do. And finally, I want to say something also about the structural issues involved. In other words, I think we have to prepare for a very long battle. In other words, this is even worse than other foreign policy issues in the sense that there's no real dissent within the foreign policy establishment. And that's what's reflected in the media. That's why Miguel gives us examples of talking to reporters. You know, in other areas of the world, you have dissenting views within the State Department, even on Israel and Palestine, where, you know, the Congress is very much under the influence of some very powerful lobbies. You still have dissent, and even though policy doesn't move very much, the debate changes. Whereas on Latin America, because there's such a consensus that, you know, we own that place from the foreign policy establishment, that you really don't get dissent. And so the media gets worse and worse, and it kind of, the disconnect between the United States and Latin America continues. In fact, I want to give you an example. I was talking to a minister of government, I won't mention the name, but somebody, a government that's got pretty good relations with the United States in Latin America. And he said, you know, we look at, we have to deal with Africa too. And there are regional bodies, and the Western powers, at least they want to know before they decide what to do, what does the regional body think about the situation in Congo or anywhere else. And he said, I find it gravely insulting that the United States couldn't care less what UNISOR thinks, what CELAC thinks, what any of the regional organizations here in the United States think. So that's the kind of disconnect we're talking about. And of course, our government and our media portrays it as, well, you know, it's the U.S. against Venezuela, maybe there's some other bad leftist countries involved that we're trying to fight, but that's not the way it's seen there. And that's another structural reason, because the United States has tried to isolate Venezuela, and the rest of Latin America sees Venezuela as part of the same team, then what happens? The United States becomes increasingly isolated. And that was the policy. I mean, the Bush administration was more explicit about that. They actually said we want to isolate Venezuela. The Obama administration doesn't say that, but they've been quite aggressive in pursuing the same policy. Let me give you the most recent example, and that's the Venezuelan election on April 14th. Now, this is something where our government went to move backward towards a policy that they haven't had really for the last decade, which is non-recognition of the election and the electoral results. Now, just to, let me give you a little anecdote to show how outrageous that is from a protocol point of view. First of all, some of you may remember when Chavez was in the UN in 2006, and he made this famous speech about the devil was here, and it smelled like sulfur and so on, and about Bush. And Rafael Correa was running for president in Ecuador at that time, and he was at a press conference. They asked him, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, I think it was an insult to the devil, because the devil is intelligent, and Bush is, well, and he used the word that is, kind of means idiot. And so what happened? 3 weeks later, he won the election, and Bush called immediately to congratulate him and didn't ask for an apology. Now, that was a moment when the U.S. Government was really focused on Venezuela and wanted to show the world that it just didn't hate out all the left governments in the region, and so they wanted to say, particularly focusing on. But that shows it's a matter of course that you congratulate the winner and recognize the election. And what happened in Venezuela? Well, you had an election. There's really no doubt whatsoever about the outcome. And for those of you who are interested, we published a little statistical paper so you can see the actual math of it. Because your average person, if you ask them, they think, well, that's something like Bush v. Gore in 2000. We don't really know who won. Probably maybe it was stolen, whatever. And but in fact, there was an audit conducted on the day of the election, on April 14th. And some people were there. Alex was there. He saw it. And there were many witnesses from other countries, and there were witnesses from both sides in the election, and the community was invited, and they watched. Tens of thousands of people in all the polling places watched as the electronic machines were tallied, and the paper receipt that every voter takes and puts in their ballot box, which we wish we had here in the United States for our electronic machine, they put it into a box, and at the end, when the polls closed, they counted the receipts and they checked the machines, and there were no discrepancies. And in fact, Capriles has not alleged a single discrepancy, nor has any witness come forward and said, I saw a machine count recorded that didn't match the count in front of my eyes. And yet, what was the, oh yeah, so then we did a little probabilistic calculation, because they took a sample of, a random sample of 53% of all the machines. There's over 20,000 machines under the election. And some of you who have statistics may know that's a very large sample. And so as a result, the probability that you could get the result that you saw on April 14th, if in fact Capriles had won the vote, is far less than 1 in 25,000 trillion. So there's really no practical doubt about the result of that election. And, Capriles has alleged other complaints, but you can see them on the web, and they're pretty, they don't really amount to very much. And nothing, they're not even as bad as what we usually see in the U.S. In terms of, people wearing red shirts into the polling places. I mean, there were things that obviously, they didn't really make much difference. And nobody's really, there's no credible questioning of this election, and yet the U.S. response to the election was to say that we want 100%. They said, in order to be, well, the legitimacy, they basically said, depends on 100% recount. That is, you have to compare all the other ballots and all the other receipts with the vote, and they weren't going to recognize the election. And then, of course, they tried to hijack the OAS, which, Miguel mentioned that this is one of the reasons why all the Latin American countries got together and formed the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, because they wanted to have an organization without the U.S. and Canada, because when things like this come up, the U.S. got the Secretary General of the OAS, Miguel Insulza, to say to go along with them on this temporarily. And then, of course, everybody rebelled, and he had to change his position. The same, of course, with the government of Spain, which was the only other government in the world, practically, that they could get to go along with this. So, but you can see this is very aggressive. This is saying, this is real. I'm trying to think how to describe how aggressive this is. I mean, this is something that I mean, especially you consider that, according to the New York Times, on the day after the election, that weekend, Maduro had actually reached out to through Bill Richardson, had reached out to the State Department and asked if relations could be improved. And that was the response. It was, we hate you, and we're going to do everything we can to undermine and delegitimize your government. So that's very, very strong. And until you know, I don't know how much, you know, how much I can emphasize or overemphasize how aggressive that is against a democratically elected government, who had the support, of course, of the entire hemisphere, and they made sure they let everybody know, too. You know, Lula denounced the United States for its interference, and then Dilma said something recently, too, which was very similar. And even though she's being invited for the first official state visit here in October, in 20 years from a head of state of Brazil, you know, the United States is trying to, again, try to divide the good left from the bad left or whatever, but you can see they're very, very much on the same team. And our government doesn't want to understand that, and neither does our foreign policy establishment. Now, another thing that Miguel mentioned was Paraguay, the parliamentary coup there in last June. And I think it was actually a little worse, because you didn't have time, but a little worse than you mentioned, because we now know, because of some investigative reporting by Natalia Viana, who published it in The Nation, as well as Agência Pública in Brazil, and that the U.S. government paid some of the people involved, and also, again, hijacked the OAS in terms of getting a committee of friendly representatives of friendly governments to go down there and say everything was okay. Impeach the president in less than 24 hours without really any time to defend himself. And so this is the kind of thing, again, shows that our government, I mean, I don't like to say this, you know, I would like to say that there's, I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but I do think there's a lot we can still do. But this shows that our government really wants to get rid of any left government in Latin America that they can, and it's just a question of targets of opportunity. And Brazil, too. I mean, we have documents from the Freedom of Information Act from 2005 that show that the State Department funded an effort within Brazil to try and change the law there to make it in ways that would weaken the Workers' Party of Brazil, the governing party. So again, it really is, the way Miguel described, it's a Cold War kind of outlook, which says that, you know, we want all these governments gone if we can, and of course we can't really get rid of the bigger and stronger ones. And so why is it so bad? I guess somebody's going to have to tell me when I'm in 5 minutes. Okay. So maybe I won't talk that much about why, the structural reasons. But I think, you know, just briefly, it has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, our elections aren't really dependent on this. You know, the State Department, the White House doesn't care. So he leaves it to people in the State Department who are really mostly no different from what they were in the Bush administration. And you have forces in Congress that are, you know, you have Cuban, Miami Cuban kind of lobby as well. I mean, so you don't have any, they just don't care. So we have to make them care a little bit, or somehow try and change it. And I think what one thing Congress can do is to be a voice. That's because, again, because of this kind of vicious circle between the media and the foreign policy establishment, where there's no dissent, and they keep creating and reinforcing a kind of Orwellian world. It's very important, any voices that can say anything and get in the press make a really big difference. In fact, I mean, we people here, this panel, have changed the media considerably just by, you know, embarrassing, not directly trying to shame them, but just saying the obvious truth, and then they have to change it. You know, they do. If it's there, and I think that's extremely important, and any member of Congress can do that. I think another thing that the Congress can do, and you might get Republican support for it as well, is cut off some of the funding that's used it's called democracy promotion, but of course it's not. These are among the most democratic governments that Latin America has ever had, and but they're not doing what our government wants, and so therefore we need democracy promotion there. And I think that kind of thing, I mean, in a time of budget cuts and sequester and everything else. These are things that I think would be quite popular to cut this money off. And anywhere you see democracy promotion, there's quite a lot of it actually. The total amount in the State Department budget is actually billions around through the world. I don't know exactly how much it is in Latin America, but it's a significant amount of money, and it does, I think, a lot of damage, and it alienates these governments. And one of the reasons we still don't have an ambassadorial relationship with Bolivia is because of exactly this, because of what USAID was doing there, because they wouldn't even disclose, they refused to disclose what their activities are. So that's another thing that Congress can do too as well at the same time. So, well, what exactly is going for? And so those are a couple of the things I think are really important. I just want to say one thing about the importance of it. I think this is very important. I understand everybody here and everybody around the Congress, they have to choose their battles. And we have war in the Middle East, and we have, the possibility of much worse, even conflagrations in places like Syria and everything else. But I think that Latin America is still important because it is, perhaps the only region in the world where you see progressive change taking place peacefully through the ballot box, historic changes, which I won't have time to talk about here. But I think this is something that is just very important for anybody who cares about the progress in the world. Thank you.
And just one little extra plug for CBER, which is I think we have a sign-up sheet back here where you can choose to receive various emails concerning our reports, our articles, and also you might be interested in our Americans blog, which spends a considerable amount of time. We have several postings each week that debunk a lot of the conventional wisdom on Latin America. So you can just find that on our website. So we are now going to shift. We've been talking a lot about South America, the developments there. We're going to focus now more on Mesoamerica, Mexico, and Central America, and a bit Colombia. And we're going to start off with John Lindsay Poland, who has done a lot of terrific work on U.S. militarization and drug policy in Colombia and in Central America and Mexico. He is the co-director of the Fellowship on Reconciliation Task Force on Latin America and Caribbean. He previously served with the Peace Brigades International, the peace team member in Guatemala and El Salvador. He is the editor of Colombia Update and founded the Fellowship on Reconciliation's Colombia Peace Presence Team, and is the author of numerous articles on U.S. militarism in Latin America, as well as books, including Emperors in the Jungle, The Hidden History of the U.S. in Panama. And John's going to show us the PowerPoint.
Can you see that? Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I wanted to start with an observation about a phrase that you hear often, which is the drug war, or the war on drugs. And I want to say a couple things about it, because lately the Obama administration has been attempting to recast drug policy, international drug policy, as not a war. And what I want to say is that not only is it rhetorically a war, but it is actually a war. So even when we think of it as a drug war, that's often a way of thinking like war on poverty. It's a way of thinking this is something that you mobilize all of the resources, policy resources, and material resources that you can to tackle a problem. But in fact, what I'd like to suggest is that it is a war, even if the resources are not on the scale of, say, the U.S. commitment in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so I'm going to suggest that in a few different ways. First of all is in terms of what resources are actually being dedicated. So I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. So this slide here shows different kinds of U.S. military activity in Latin America and the Caribbean for the last 11 years. And there are different kinds that are, some of which are more transparent than others, some of which are more visible than others. So at the very top, the purple section there is mostly what is cited in the media or what comes before appropriations committees on a country-by-country basis, which is the Foreign Ops bill. But there are other kinds as well. So the Pentagon increasingly has an enormous amount of military assistance at its disposal every year. And that is not programmed by country in advance. It is not rationalized in advance. It is not required to give any kind of policy rationale. And that is an increasing amount. Even, actually, this is all counter-drug aid, so the Section 1004 is assistance. Now, then there's also Pentagon operations. So DoD contracts, which are measured here, reflect primarily, some of it reflects assistance, but most of it reflects operations. So you have the 4th Fleet goes out and does something in Latin America. You have the operation of the Soldocano Air Base in Honduras. Those things are not assistance, they are U.S. operations, and they're mostly reflected here in these contracts. There are some things that are not reflected in contracts that also are not counted here. And then finally, you have arms sales, which are increasingly the bulk of the way in which the United States plays a role in the militarization of the region. Now, within this region, the model that is being pointed to by a broad sector of policymakers is Colombia. Colombia is supposedly cited as a success because the war is tilted, the balance of the war has tilted to the Colombian armed forces. That's the primary reason people give for saying that this is a success. On the other hand, you've had 2.5 million people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes since Plan Colombia began in 2000. That's another measure, another macro measure. What is often also not measured is what was the behavior, the human rights conduct of the units that actually received assistance. And so I'm going to ask you to refer to this little handout here. It's always good to have a plan B. And this particular graph shows the number of civilian killings attributed to units that received U.S. assistance in the 2 years after they received assistance. And also the number of Colombian soldiers who were trained over the course of 2001 to 2008. And you'll see that there is, unfortunately, for a good part of that period, a moderate correlation. At the very least, one can say that it did not have a positive impact on the units that were receiving assistance. The following slide shows a little bit about why, which is that what the Colombian armed forces did that was supported by President Uribe, president from 2002 to 2010, was to measure their success by body counts. That is, how many guerrillas were being killed. And as the Colombian armed forces became more successful, they actually had fewer guerrillas to fight. Or to fight them would have required more aggressive or more risky operations on their part. So what did they do in order to demonstrate body counts, in order to be promoted, in order to advance in their army careers? Units went out and found civilians, brought them to other places, executed them, and counted them as guerrillas killed in combat. From 2000 to 2010, there are 3,500 cases, the vast majority of which are known as false positives. A positive was a kill in combat, and these were false killed because they were actually civilians killed in combat. So this is the model that is being pointed to in the rest of the region. And it's being used primarily in Central America and Mexico. So if you go to the next page, you'll see, actually following that, I'm going to skip over some of these examples from Colombia. And you'll see here military aid, arms sales, and duty contracts in Central America. And you'll see that these are not only increasing, but have peaked in 2011. And one thing I also want you to know about both this and the first slide that I showed you is that the average over the Obama administration is higher than the average over the Bush years. In other words, what Miguel and Mark were saying is reflected in these numbers, that the United States is increasing both assistance operations as well as arms sales in the region compared to the Bush years. Now, one of the ways that the United States is doing that is by building bases in the region. So in Central America particularly, the United States has built a number of primarily naval bases that are nominally in the name of the Central American countries. But when you have a base that is designed and built by the U.S. Army Corps, that brings in U.S. military trainers to train host forces, that has visits by the U.S. Fourth Fleet, and where the doctrine for counter-drug operations is provided by the United States, what is the difference, really, when you have small countries that are nominally holding the title of these bases? And as you'll see, there are a lot of them. And the center of this, if you go to the next slide, is Honduras. Honduras is the hub for U.S. military operations in Central America. So you'll see that reflected in this pie chart, in which more than half of all the Pentagon contracts for activities in Central America in 2012, last year, were in Honduras. What you'll also see is that in this following chart, just for Honduras, is that even more so in Honduras, you won't see the U.S. military activity reflected in foreign operations appropriations. So if any of your bosses are on approps, you will not see this activity in the foreign ops bill that comes before Congress, because you'll get 2 million, 3 million, whereas the contracts and the arms sales are at a much higher level. My thesis is that primarily the United States wants to have its own launching point, and also that it doesn't entirely trust the Honduran armed forces to carry out the activities that it wants to occur in the region. And I would also add that the base in Honduras is not just used for operations in Honduras, it's also used for operations in Guatemala and elsewhere in Central America. Now, there is one disturbing fact that also reflects this activity in Honduras, which is that last year, the State Department approved an arms transfer to Honduras, which the State Department confirmed was to U.S. forces in Honduras for $1.3 billion. Now, the armed forces of Honduras have an annual budget of $265 million. So this is, apparently, we've asked people in the Southern Command, we've asked the ambassador, we've asked all kinds of people what this is, and no one can actually track it down. No one can actually say what this is. It may be, since this was an authorization, that this will not occur. But it begs the question of why was such a large militarization of the U.S. presence in Honduras authorized in the first place? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the military logic of the drug war. So in Guatemala, there is a special forces training base for the special forces called the Caiviles, which is located in the Petén region near the Mexican and Belize borders, and in a town called Poctún. The Caiviles base, the Caiviles are also known to have trained the Zetas cartel in Mexico. So the United States has been assisting the Caiviles in Poctún, and the Zetas have also set up a base for recruitment in Poctún. So the United States is training a force that is a recruiting ground and training team for the very narcotics cartel that we say that we're fighting. So here's the logic. Every kind of military training or equipment that you can provide is of value to the the criminal organizations in Mexico and Central America, because what they want is to control territory. If you control territory, you not only control the illegal commerce that goes through that territory, you can also extort all the legal commerce. That's what the Zetas are doing. That's what many of the other criminal organizations are doing. And to control territory, you need military capacity. You need military assets. You need weapons. You also need ability. So anything that we can provide to the Central American and Mexican forces is of value to the criminal organizations. And the criminal organizations can always pay more. So that means that we are inevitably always providing more assets to the thing that we say that we are fighting in the region. So that's another way in which this is military. And finally, I want to suggest that it's also military in a couple other ways. One is that the Zetas and the other criminal organizations in Mexico, because they're waging a military battle, they are looking for military weapons. This is the way in which the assault weapons ban that was proposed by Senator Feinstein is a foreign policy issue. Because the criminal organizations in Mexico, and increasingly in Central America, what they want are military-style weapons. And the way they get them, because they're illegal to purchase and they are not sold on the legal market in Mexico or in Central America, is they buy them in the southwestern states of the United States and are trafficked over the border. So, according to a study by UC San Diego, 250,000 weapons were purchased in the United States and trafficked over the border to Mexico for each of the last 3 years. So this is another way in which our free market economy for military-style weapons is supplying at least one of the sides in the war in Mexico and Central America. And finally, I want to suggest that it's a war in one other way, and that is that it's about body counts. It's about taking members of the enemy out of action. And that kind of mentality is reflected in many statements. So, for example, Assistant Secretary of State William Brownfield for narcotics has said that the bloodshed tends to occur and increase when these trafficking organizations come under some degree of pressure. In other words, it's working when there's more bloodshed because people are fighting each other. When there was a massacre in Honduras last year of 4 indigenous people on the river in Honduras by a DEA-controlled unit, anti-drug unit, there was a U.S. official who told the New York Times that the only thing there was nothing that was unknown, a surprise, or a mystery about this. For the first time in the history of that community, Honduran law enforcement interfered with narcotics smuggling. In other words, the body count of civilians is not a problem for if the center of your policy making is attempting to go after drugs and the smuggling of drugs. So we have some suggestions here, or to begin at least. One is to heed and begin to, which is a very long-term and broad kind of policy shift, which is to heed the calls both within the United States and the region to shift from a drug war to regulation of narcotics. Second is that the military aid should be cut out of the assistance to the region, because this is only exacerbating the problem. Something else that we've been calling for is that there is a premise in policymaking across the board that U.S. involvement is a positive thing. It will have a positive impact. But the thing is, no one is actually going in and looking what that impact is. There is no U.S. government agency, official, part of law that it requires any impact of any evaluation of human rights impacts for military assistance anywhere in the world. And if you want good government and you care about human rights, you would want to evaluate what are human rights impacts of something that is lethal to human beings, given military assistance. And finally, is to see the gun control debate as part of a foreign policy issue as well. And that the United States should, and we hope that your bosses, when it comes before the House particularly, will support any kind of legislation that stops the flow of assault weapons and other firearms, and as well as ammunition across the U.S.-Mexico border. Thanks very much.
Since we do want some time for Q&A, I'm glad that John brought up the case of Honduras, which is a very emblematic one. I think it really shows everything that's flawed with U.S. policy towards the region, where we saw in the first couple of presentations, the U.S. is trying to undermine democratically elected governments. In Honduras, it's actually strengthened a government that has come out of a coup in 2009. This is a coup that the U.S. initially condemned, but actually in practice, in terms of what they did, they ended up supporting the coup regime. They supported elections that were carried out in very unfree and unfair conditions in late 2009, and then they proceeded to boost military assistance to Honduras. And it's been going up ever since. And at the same time, we've been seeing a huge increase in human rights abuses carried out by security forces that are, again, being assisted by the U.S., and a huge increase in violence. And of course, Honduras now has the highest homicide rate in the region. So I think Honduras is really a case that Congress should pay attention to, and it has. To its credit, there have been a lot of great congressional letters, particularly from the Progressive Caucus, to the administration saying there's a problem with this policy, it needs to be revised. But I think what John has shown, and I think what Laura's going to show as well, is that it's not just Honduras the problem. The same policy applies to a lot of these other countries, certainly Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, etc. And so now we're going to have Laura Carlson, who's going to finish this chapter on the impact of U.S. drug and security policy. She is based in Mexico City, the director of the Center for International Policy's Americas program, columnist for Foreign Policy in Focus, and she holds a BA in Social Thought Institutions from Stanford University, a master's degree in Latin American Studies, also from Stanford, and has published numerous articles and chapters on social, economic, and political aspects of Mexico. She recently co-edited Confronting Globalization, Economic Integration, and Popular Resistance in Mexico.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you again for all being here on this very hot day, as has been mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the part that John talked about. I'm a U.S. citizen and a Mexican citizen, Latin American policy analyst, and I've lived and worked in Mexico City for more than 2 decades now. So this has given me, I think, a good vantage point to look at, to assess the impact directly of U.S. policy in the region, as well as some of the reactions of Latin American countries and peoples to that policy over time. A little history is necessary to provide context for remarks on the Obama administration's response to the historic changes that have been taking place in Latin America. And first of all, you have to go back to the relationship between Latin America and the United States during the Bush administration. After the Bush national security strategy, the post-9/11 national security strategy was released, calling for unilateral strikes and preventive actions, there was great resentment in Latin America. Many considered this justifications, the abandonment of multilateral forums to a large degree as a threat to the region and to regions throughout the world. This was also spurred by the growing political and economic power of Brazil and Venezuela, which were beginning to assert independence from the United States, and therefore more sensitive to a reassertion of hegemony that was being explicitly made by the Bush administrations. A major showdown that brought together these two kind of conflicting currents at that time, as I mentioned before, and that was the Summit of the Americas in Mar del Plata in 2005, when the United States agenda of a free trade agreement of the Americas was effectively killed by particularly alliance of the Southern Cone countries. So after these experiences, when Obama came into office, he was given more than the benefit of the doubt. There was really widespread celebration within most Latin American countries when Obama came to office, and certainly an expectation that there would be a fairly major change from this radical counterterrorism paradigm that had been imposed by Bush to a new Obama policy that nobody really knew what it would look like. In fact, there were indications of a lot of continuity in the campaign, but still there was an image that there would be something new. And this image was more or less reinforced at the Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago when Obama did talk about concepts, very important concepts to Latin America, of self-determination and, excuse me, mutual respect. This raised the hopes that there would be a break finally from this model, the whole world, seeing the whole world as in the counterterrorism threat context and the relationships within it, and led many to envision a multipolar world that Brazil was already working toward and promoting, with the United States as at least a willing and non-obstructive partner within that. A more even distribution of power and wealth, more equal societies within, modification of orthodox market views, which was already happening in many countries in Latin America. These all appeared that perhaps it would be viable without straining relations with the superpower of the North. Meanwhile, Latin American nations were making strides again in the creation of these South-South ties that freed them up from that hegemony in economic and political terms that many people have mentioned, with CELAC, UNASUR, a revisioning in some senses of Mercosur. And considering this diversification of trade relationships and kind of a more even spreading out after a huge history, of course, a long history of the U.S. hegemony in the region, as something that was by any reckoning a healthy tendency. But of course, what we know now in retrospect is that the Obama administration, instead of taking advantage of these moves to build relations among more equal partners, has reacted as if Latin America's greater independence constituted an attack on U.S. interests. It's pushed forward the same economic policies of free trade and open markets and geopolitical agendas of the past in new ways, the Alliance for the Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership when the FTAA was blocked, and perhaps most sadly has encouraged a continental divide, trying to put a wedge between the governments and the nations that are governed by center-left governments and the nations that have more conservative governments that have free trade agreements with the United States and that are considered allies. We've talked about some of the examples of what for many was an unexpected intolerance of the Obama administration. And we've talked several times now about Honduras being the prime example like that. Living this and blogging it from Mexico at the time, it was a roller coaster. I mean, there was a time at the beginning moment when there was a recognition that this was a coup d'etat. The Obama administration even recognized this. And then there was this degeneration where we saw peace talks that were meant to stall the reinstatement of the constitutionally elected president. And of course, in the end, the State Department brokered an agreement that allowed Honduras to have coup-sponsored elections that were then validated despite the boycott and the lack of legitimacy of the electoral process itself. And in addition to this not only betrayed Honduras, and had a great deal to do with the fact that now it's kind of a no man's land of dysfunctional institutions with the highest crime and violence rates in spite, or maybe not in spite, maybe in some ways even because of the fact of being a security hub for United States operations, as John mentioned. And it also betrayed many of what most people consider the United States' most deeply held democratic principles. Other instances are the hostility between Venezuela and Cuba that we've seen, the continued embargo, really very only cosmetic changes in terms of the relationship with Cuba, and the attitude of primarily democracy promotion, as Mark mentioned, toward Ecuador and Bolivia and other countries. Now, what I really want to focus on, the little time that I have, is on the flip side of the us versus them view, where we've talked about the aggression against many of the countries that are considered enemies now because of the center-left governments, to look at the way allied countries are being used as platforms for the defense of U.S. interests. And in short, what you can say is they're being militarized. This has profoundly changed our day-to-day life in Mexico, where along with Central America, as John pointed out, the Obama administration has supported the expanding use of the military in public safety activities having to do, especially under the guise of the drug war. In Mexico, the Merida Initiative was designed and initiated in the Bush administration and then was embraced and greatly expanded under Obama. It was supposed to be over in 2010, according to the original Bush design, and was immediately announced that it would be indefinite. We're talking about a permanent drug war in Mexico, according to the Obama administration. It's really framed, although the drug war is what's most prominent, as counterterrorism. There is no real proven terrorism threat from Mexico to the United States. But a counterterrorism, a counter-narcotics, and a border security initiative. What this did is it meant that aid that had been hovering around 50 million for many years to Mexico shot up to about an average of 300, and mostly all of it was concentrated in this counter-narcotics model on the military and police and related training programs. And this is not counting the Department of Defense contracts that are harder to track. So what are the results? 5 years into this Merida initiative, the drug war that has been supported and encouraged by the United States government, the Obama administration in particular, we have 80,000 people dead. We have 230,000 to 1 million people in Mexico only who've been displaced. There's some 26,000 people recognized by the government as disappeared. There's been a huge rise in femicide and gender-based violence. Youth recruitment from organized crime is on the rise, especially among youth who have very few options, due again to economic policies that have increased unemployment and the buying power of a working wage. And we have an increase, ironically, because this is supposed to be a rule of law program, in extortion and corruption within the government. Without going into it, the mechanism is fairly simple. You send the army into the streets, you send the police into the streets to fight a drug war. There's widespread corruption within these institutions. Oftentimes they're on the side of one cartel or another. You destabilize the relationship between the cartels and who controls what territory by taking out kingpins in one area, so there's a rush in to fill the power back in there. And you have rivalries and you have turf wars throughout the country, sometimes stronger in one place, sometimes popping up in others. It used to be that the drug states were vocalized in one part, and now we're seeing it occurring in more and more parts of national territory. Again, still mostly on the border, but also in other places. So some of the people say this list of woes that we're facing in Mexico is really what we're fighting and not a result. But even the proponents have mentioned that this amount of violence, as we saw in the Brownfield quote, is a direct result of this particular strategy. And we're supposed to accept it, both as U.S. taxpayers and as Mexican citizens having to face it in daily life as sort of the darkness before the dawn, with actually not a single ray of light on the horizon. I work in the Mexican Women Human Rights Defenders Network, and every week we see more cases of attacks on women human rights defenders from the government and security forces, the majority, from the little documentation that we have so far, and of course also from criminal groups. And then often from an unidentifiable combination, because there really is no clear line between good guys and bad guys in this war, and that's one of the big myths that justifies continuing pouring resources into it. In our office, tears are a constant within the office. A week ago, my son's best friend's father was shot and killed in broad daylight. Last week, my office mate's best friend and her 14-year-old son were murdered. Organized crime and crime itself, of course, has always been a factor in Mexican society, but I've been there for 26 years and I've never ever seen anything like this. It's not only violence, but it's a complete breakdown in the social fabric that has changed our lives. And despite the human tragedy that this security strategy has caused and the consensus on its failure, the Merida Initiative continues without clear benchmarks, without a thorough review of the consequences, and the drug war is being expanded in Central America and the Caribbean. So we have to ask ourselves why, and why under an Obama administration that seemed like it might be a little less Pentagon-bound and hawkish. And this is a question that of course haunts many of us. What we've seen is a dangerous inertia that Obama has been unwilling or unable, that's a big debate, and I'm thoroughly convinced of its combination of both, to confront. First of all, the Pentagon budget dynamic. John described how it's going up. This is the case, the hammer that sees every problem as a nail. And it has far too much power within our foreign policy. In Mexico and Central America, the Pentagon, through NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM, are literally driving the foreign policy. And this has meant a serious deterioration in what should be a far more multifaceted relation. This is something that Obama sought to correct in image on his recent trip, but has done little or nothing to change in deeds. The second is the power of the defense, intelligence, security, lobbies. These economic interests exercise way too much sway in Congress, we all know it, and they encourage the drug war as a new market for their goods and services. The third is that persistent Cold War mentality that's been mentioned, that views the world in an us versus them, a friend versus foe, as Miguel stated, vision, and that's still strong even though the name of the them changes. So we've seen it go from communists to insurgents to terrorists to drug traffickers, and the current absolutely unfounded category that's in vogue of narco-terrorists. There are threats that exist, there's no question about it, but the simplification of the threats without any attempt to understand their deep roots in flawed societies promotes these militaristic strategies that put more people at risk. The fourth is a patriarchal and paternalistic assumptions that underlie foreign policy, and that is that weaker entities require protective force. This is the same mentality that generates domestic violence, and it generates a violent response to any challenge in the realm of geopolitical control. And then finally, the militarization of Mexico, Colombia, Central America aims to counterbalance the perceived threats to U.S. interests posed by the center-left governments, and to assure U.S. access to natural resources in cases considered insecure in those nations. That is to say that these are countries, and especially with militarization, with U.S. military presence, the United States believes that it can control and is therefore looking to rely more and more heavily on for scarce resources into the future. This was stated specifically in the analysis of Obama's recent Mexico and Central America trip that was made by Roberta Jacobson of Western Hemisphere Affairs and Ricardo Zuniga, and it's really scary to us. The idea that you counterbalance governments that have plural and different points of views ideologically by militarizing your ally countries that are in no position to resist that militarization, it just ups the ante and creates more risk factors and conflicts throughout the hemisphere. We can fix some of this despite the old mentalities and the vested interest. What we need, and this is a job of both Congress and the job of citizen movements, is first of all more transparency. To do our job as policy analysts, to analyze these programs and the impacts, to try to move toward a facts-based and evaluation-based foreign policy, we need a lot more information than we're getting out of government. There's no excuse as taxpayers for them to keep keeping the information on the contracting, on the expenditures that are going into this drug wars from us, and we need to demand it. Secondly, we need more debate. Mark has mentioned, others have mentioned that there's no dissent, there's no room for dissent on these issues. There's an assumption that there's a consensus that is not existing in other parts. There's thousands of people marching in Mexico against the drug war, pleading to pay attention to their victims, There's groups popping up all over victims' families that are saying this security strategy is responsible for the fact that our father doesn't come home at night anymore and nobody is listening. There have been hearings on the Merida Initiative. There's been reports by Congress. There's been GAO reports. And yet not once that I know of has anybody who opposes the Merida Initiative been invited to testify at one of those hearings. And then finally, the United States should lead by example is something that Obama has said often. And it's not happening at all. The United States hasn't even signed on to the human rights conventions that bind countries in the hemisphere, even in cases where the United States is stepping up and accusing many of those countries of human rights violations under those same conventions that it hasn't signed. So it needs to show its willingness to become a part of the human rights efforts in the continent and also in the world as a large, and to put human rights at the center of its foreign policy by minimally signing on and ratifying some of those major conventions. We have to defund these disastrous drug war programs like Merida and invest in peace in the hemisphere. And we have an excellent basis with which to do it. It's not a hemisphere that presents clear and present danger or threats to the United States. There's a lot of talk about spillover violence, there's a lot of talk about narco-terrorism, and when you look beyond that talk, what you do not find is any real evidence of it. Nobody's asking anybody to close their eyes to threats to U.S. security. But we are saying that when we evaluate threats, we should be evaluating real threats and not trumped up threats that are designed to keep open a war that is killing people beyond our borders and it's costing taxpayers a huge amount of money here in the United States. In this way, instead of fomenting division and violence, the Western Hemisphere could really be an example of peaceful coexistence and cooperation, building on some of the real advances of these countries that the Obama administration is presenting as threats. And this certainly is our hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for that wonderful presentation. It was also a great conclusion to this panel. And now we don't have a whole lot of time for Q&A. Brandon and Haley, how long do we have to go? Just to get a sense.
So I think at least 10 minutes.
Okay, well, we'll get started. I think what would make most sense is to take a few questions at a time. So I think we'll do that. So who would like to start? Any questions? Yes.
So Father Miranda with Hispan TV. It's been mentioned that the military expenditures in Honduras is unquestionable, and there's no answers to the questions that arise about such amount of money put in the military base in Honduras. Also, it's been mentioned that military is being a counterbalance to the left shift in Latin America. The question is the United States going back to the old practices of supporting the military coups like Condor operation in 1980s?
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yes.
It's not so much a question, it's an observation, a continuation of the seamlessness of the Bush-Obama. Is the Council of the Americas gave a conference recently in the State Department. Council of Americas is a private organization. The president is Negroponte, and Joe Biden was there, the vice president, and he returned to Negroponte and said, I can't remember the exact words, but something like, I don't know anyone in the Foreign Service of the United States who has done more to serve the interests of the United States. And this was in the context of a conference on Latin America, and in terms of transparency, I would be interested in knowing what has Negroponte been doing for the Obama government in Latin America.
Very good question. Some more questions, maybe in the back of the room? Right back there? Any others? start with this too.
So in response to your question about is the United States returning to operations like Operation Condor, we might not know for a number of years, just as we didn't know until a number of years after Operation Condor. Because the kind of information that we can get now about intelligence and black operations, things that would be highly unpopular if they were disclosed, is very limited. I think in terms of the military expenditures, my sense is that the U.S., it's still that backyard mentality. Your backyard is something that you want to control. That's how you deal with your backyard. It is your backyard. You don't want it to be overgrown in weeds. You want it, it's yours. And you want to control it. And that is what the United States appears to want. So whether you're controlling a leftist government, whether you're controlling a drug business that you don't get the profits from, whether you're controlling somebody who's actually on your side ideologically, but might not be behaving in the way that you would like them to. You know, there's any number of ways in which the militarization of the region sends a message. We're still in control. And and because we haven't signed not only human rights international treaties, but other kinds of, the United States has shown that it is willing to violate other kinds of international agreements about aggression. So that particular disposition of the United States sends a message that it is willing to act now or in the future. And the militarization offers the United States the capacity to do so in whatever direction.
I wanted just simply to address the question about foreign policy, because there is a line to be drawn here from what you mentioned in terms of Negroponte, and we can add Elliot Abrams and Roger Noriega, because, I mean, these are the individuals that one sees on public television. These are the individuals who are presented as the commentators, the analysts. So they're in the State Department. They are then recycled through a series of think tanks in Washington, and then they're back in the State Department. And again, the continuity is there. From Negroponte's policy is of disinformation during the conflict in Central America, where he was in Washington in charge of the information. And he's the famous one who talked about the arrival in Nicaragua of MiGs from Russia, which in fact were actually tractors. But nonetheless, the image in the New York Times was that they were MiGs. This is the same thing of Roger Noriega, the same thing to a series of individuals who really have never left the State Department because their influence is still there. That's why I would rhetorically say that we see a continuity in terms of policy. It was framed by this idea of the Cold War, because again, Central America and the conflicts in Central America in the 80s was still framed in the context of a superpower contention over the Cold War. Remove superpower contention, and you still have the notion, again, of reclaiming this territory, of fearing it being lost, and the Obama administration not challenging that. I mean, it's interesting to go back to the candidacy of Obama in 2008 and see him propose a new foreign policy for Latin America, a new alliance for progress. I don't know where he got that from, but it was a new alliance for progress for Latin America. The one time he mentioned it. And candidate Obama had all these policies against the free trade with Colombia unless labor issues were respected. But then President Obama changed dramatically and did not challenge the State Department on the very issues that candidate Obama had previously. So we see a continuity, and that's what I keep insisting, that we see as a continuity with that Cold War policy mentality that seeks to reclaim territory, that sees challenges from a progressive left in Latin America who is elected as a challenge to an undermining U.S. foreign policy.
I just want to say one very brief thing on that, and that is to take off on what Miguel was saying. One of the big problems we have here in the United States is that we don't have an independent civil society on foreign policy issues that's recognized or seen in the media. And so, you know, it's kind of like North Korea or something. On foreign policy issues, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it's really pretty bad. Almost everybody you see on television commenting on these issues is either a government official or a former government official or is getting money from the government. And that's why I think that independent members of Congress can play such a huge role, because all they have to do is say something and they become an important part of this independent civil society that most of the public is missing.
So our panelists here are neither government officials nor getting any money from the U.S. or any other government, and they're rare voices.
Someone gave us a bottle of water.
Both in the media and here in Congress, and so please take advantage of them being here and ask any questions.
Why is it that the U.S. has been so adamant opposed to Venezuela?
Okay, that's one.
And there's a ton of reasons, but it has been so consistent that it's amazing.
I'm going to piggyback on that. I'm Lisa Sullivan of SOA Watch. I live in Venezuela. I so much appreciate this panel because it confirms the absolute disconnect between our reality in Latin America and the perception in the U.S. But my question is similar. Given a real concrete example of that, how the rest of the world has recognized Venezuelan elections and the U.S. has not, is there any initiative in Congress or elsewhere to push the U.S. to recognize these elections?
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so it's being described as a leftward shift, but it seems in some ways the U.S. government and conservative forces in Latin America have been successful in stalling that shift as far as the coup in Honduras and Paraguay. So if I could ask for some short-term projections between now and, say, the end of Obama's second term. We have elections in Chile and El Salvador with potential left-leaning leaders coming to power. So what can Latin America do to continue this leftward shift, even in the face of obstruction from the United States and other forces?
Okay, let's take one more. I don't know what would be good. Yes.
Yeah, a couple of you mentioned FTAs as being problematic, recently Colombia, Panama, and before that NAFTA. What do you see as alternatives to it?
Venezuela's question, I would really say that the way to understand is that Chavez, when he's elected in 1998 in December, breaks a tradition of an example country. I mean, there's a famous quote that I use in my book that says, from Forbes magazine, that says, if Venezuela had not existed, we would have had to invent the Republic of Venezuela as a model for what U.S. private capital and initiative can do in the region. So there's this very close relationship with Venezuela that somehow the U.S. never perceived, never questioned, and in 1998 it's broken. And it's fundamentally transferred because of the election of Hugo Chavez Frias and then the subsequent re-election and the constitutional change. Add to that so that Venezuela becomes the first of many countries in Latin America that then become the promoters of regional integration, national sovereignty, energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, and set the trend. So if you think in terms of what Venezuela laid out in 1999, in 2000, has today become mainstream in Latin America. Many countries in the region now adopted what Venezuela said in its constitution in 1999 and has become mainstream. Add to that it has the largest reserves of oil in the world, surpassing Saudi Arabia with the potential of over 512 billion barrels of oil. And you have a very explosive combination of a country that used to be a model democracy and now has become the opposite, and a country that also has the hugest reserves of oil in Latin America. In terms of what has happened with the right, yes, the right has been very active. The right has been trying at regional meetings and with the support of the U.S. to pick out low-lying fruit, what I would like to refer to weaknesses that they saw in the process of integration and the process of change by picking on Honduras, a country that had a leader whose party was divided and social movements that were still emerging. The same thing in Paraguay, where Lugo was in the midst of a series of crises. So these were very specific examples of what they attempted to do. And we see, but again, we've seen every other electoral change been ratified, and we should welcome that. These are electoral changes, not violent changes that we've seen elsewhere in the world. So that we have elections in El Salvador, which are going to pit the FMLN's candidate Sanchez Sereno against a divided right, increasing their possibilities. And by all polls right now, Bachelet, even though someone spat in her face yesterday, is leading in the polls and is probably will return to power in Chile. So again, I think the Latin Americans are doing their part. I think what we're asking for is that the North Americans now also do their part.
But on the question of what to do to encourage a leftward shift, I think that it's not our job to become involved in that within the Latin American countries. And rather what we need to encourage from this side is the strict adhesion to the concept of self-determination. And that means not getting in the way particularly, not obstructing the processes there. The elimination of democracy promotion programs is absolutely essential because they're working along a very blurred line in terms of the legitimate and a line that it's absolutely clear the United States would never allow within its own borders. And I think that it's fair to require a criteria that says, is this the kind of activity that we implement in our country before we fund it in other countries as well? So that commitment to self-determination is really the most important thing. And then before handing over the mic, I'll just address briefly the question about what kinds of alternatives to these free trade agreements are there. And of course, that's precisely what we're seeing in terms of the South-South regional integration. Most of these are focused on economic alternatives, encouraging more equal relations between trade partners, less trade dependency, changes in many of the draconian terms that are included in free trade agreements that, for example, prohibit access to life-giving medicines under monopoly patents that can last for 20 years and often more, and that this is the kind of thing that they're trying to avoid through the other relationships. And we also see that actually there's so many free trade agreements out there, and that trade functions heavily and fluently without these kinds of agreements. And what these agreements in effect are really doing is not facilitating trade or opening markets, especially for the developing country, but creating a bill of rights for transnational corporations that offers them the most favorable conditions possible. So the best thing to do for developing countries is to flat out reject them and to seek a more balanced trade policy in general. It's not a question of one very specific model, which is the free trade agreement, against another very specific model, but rejecting the free trade agreements and building trade and commerce and investment terms according to their own development criteria.
If I could just add to that, one example of what Laura is talking about in terms of the impacts of these trade agreements is that in the years since the Colombia-US FTA has been implemented, the amount of trade exports from Colombia to the United States have actually declined. So it actually hasn't even really helped the Colombian exporters because, of course, some of them are being underpriced by subsidized agriculture in the United States. The other thing I would add is that for the United States, we need to invest more in education and infrastructure so that our economy is not as dependent on that kind of trade in order to keep the economy greased. And of course, that's one of the big decisions that's in front of the Congress now, is how much, in the face of the sequester and in the face of other more longer-term decisions, the United States is going to invest in education and the infrastructure that's required to supply our own population.
So everybody answered all the questions except Lisa, so I'll do that. The question was, is anybody doing anything to get the U.S. government to recognize the election? Actually, one reporter, Rand Lee from the Associated Press, I think it was him, was he the one who grilled the State Department? Yeah, on that one. And he kind of almost forced them to say that they did, but not quite. And we do have an effort that any member of Congress could support too. It's a letter circulating from statisticians and economists basically saying that according to probability and statistics, there is, that less than 1 in 25,000 trillion chance that you could have gotten the April 14th audit results if Capriles actually got the majority of the votes in the remaining machines. And so that's the kind of thing that anybody could make a statement about and kind of try to force the media to recognize it. Right now they're ignoring it's kind of like reporting on climate change and not mentioning any of the physical evidence. that is the most important piece of evidence you have. You have this audit that took place. And so I think it would be great if anybody can get anybody to get that in the meeting.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, there have been a lot of voices in the region calling on the U.S. to recognize these elections. Of course, Brazil is a big one, and also Argentina and Bolivia and other governments. It hasn't been covered very much in the media, but I don't think there have been any strong domestic voices so far. Okay, and we're still here, so we're going to try to hold on the room a little bit longer and maybe have a third round of questions. Eric?
It seems like there's a trend in coups that are uncertain, like legal justification. Honduras, we saw some of that. And I think it was so justified in the U.S. eyes, or legally, that they said it wasn't effectively a coup. What can we do to raise awareness and take action against these types of coups that seem to be increasing, finding legal technicalities to overturn the will of the people in the last election?
Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think the effect in curtailing violence will be if marijuana is legalized in the U.S., if and when it seems like, since more states are moving towards that?
In the context of what we're discussing here, what is the opinion of the panel on the reversal of the decision in Guatemala on Rios-Montt, and what that means for the Central America?
Okay, was there a question in the third row? Okay.
Yeah, I guess I was just a little concerned to hear to the panelists just say all democracy promotion programs should be defunded. There was a long-term, 5-year academic independent study that showed that democracy promotion programs had an impact in increasing transparency and democratic means in governments that got those programs. And I'm wondering if you're kind of throwing out the baby bathwater here, because there have been some that felt like were too political, but a lot of them are technical aid, helping countries to learn how to construct budgets or have transparency in their budgets. Countries like Haiti, who now had transparency that they've never had before in their budgets, just technical things like that. So I guess I just want a clarification of, do you not think there are any, there's just a lot of evidence showing that there's been a lot of good that's come out of those programs, and that why you just feel like the whole thing should be funded in the face of that.
Great questions. Who wants to start?
I want to answer that one. I can't first.
Well, also, Mark, you have to run the panel, so you're allowed to go first.
So, on Haiti is a good example. I mean, that was where the money came from to actively overthrow the elected government in 2004. It was from the International Republic Institute, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. They were the leader of that program, but there was a lot of other State Department money that went into a whole campaign which used massive amounts of media and everything they could to destabilize the government until it was overthrown by force. And that was an actual effort. The New York Times did a very nice investigative piece about it. And that was just one example of many. Again, that's where the country is weak and they can actually use this directly. I mean, I'm not going to go through all the other efforts. Yeah, I agree that there are some programs, NED even funds some decent organizations here and there. And if we could preserve that, that's fine. But overall, there's no doubt, there's absolutely no doubt that in Latin America, in this hemisphere, these programs have been used consistently to undermine democracy. And to me, it's huge. And when you overthrow democratically elected governments, destabilize democratically elected governments, I mean, there's nothing worse than that. Any kind of technical support that you give to people is never going to make up for that. So I don't have any problem. And other members of Congress are not particularly left on this issue. Barney Frank voted twice to zero out. I think it was the National Endowment for Democracy. And there were, So there's plenty of support for it there. It just needs to be organized. And then, of course, if we get to the point where we want to, reinstate programs that are positive, I'm all for it. Thank you. Sorry, I have to go.
The other thing I'd mention is in Latin America, large parts of the population, these programs have a very bad image, and so they tend to, like, we've had a lot of problems with Mexico because they get divisions and this trust between non-governmental organizations that are receiving that money, and they may be doing fine things, but the fact that they're even related to those programs casts suspicion on their work in society and causes a lot of messes that way. I think that the baby there can easily be preserved if the programs themselves were gotten rid of. There are many, many types of, and channels for doing technical advising on good governance issues, and I would include the recommendation that a lot of that work actually go through multilateral forums. This eliminates the suspicion and the possibility of the United States using it not so much for the technical improvement in the home and receiving country, but as a legitimate and transparent program to provide the types of consulting and technical training that are needed if you went through something like the OAS or other multilateral organizations. I want to touch on the point of marijuana legalization because it's critical to us in Mexico. Whenever we do the critique of the drug war and talk about the violence it's generated, of course, and very reasonably, the next question is, well, what would you do differently? And especially, what would you do if confronted with the very real strength of organized crime groups? And one factor in that, and there's no blueprint, of course, that I or anyone can offer at this point, is the legalization of marijuana in the United States for the simple reason that when you eliminate this huge chunk of illegal income from in an underground economy, when you regulate it and include legal sourcing, because there's a lot of decriminalization that doesn't include legal sourcing, I don't know what that means. I think that's always been confusing to me. But for us in Mexico, it's critical to include legal sourcing. Then you're taking on the market, and we've even seen reactions about medical marijuana laws from organized crime. It's kind of hard to prove or anything, where there's a genuine concern that they're going to be losing a big part of their market, and marijuana supplies to start. And it also represents differences in the calculations, because again, we're talking about a clandestine economy, but it represents the bulk of their income. And that's the way to dismantle organized crime. You go after their financial empires through money laundering. You go after taking down their market. You cannot do it with this militaristic confrontational model. Then finally, just a question. I was at a panel yesterday on the Rios-Montt decision. Of course, everyone was very, very disappointed and outraged at the annulment of the verdict, but there's still a strong sense in reality that the verdict itself and the trial itself marked a huge step forward. One of the things that they're planning on doing, the legal way forward on this particular case is not clear. There's a chance of starting over at zero, but it's kind of a mess. But one of the things too that they mentioned, this has to do with the Negroponte question, is that it's really important for people to take what we've learned from that trial about accountability and begin to remember the history. And that means that an Elliot Abrams should not be walking around as if he were a legitimate authority on foreign policy issues in this day and time. Just as a Negroponte has to be reminded of a dark past that included illegal activities. Because unless we build a new foreign policy, on a steadfast commitment to legality and to principles, and do not allow these people who have proven illegal activities in their past to be walking around, as respected individuals on Capitol Hill, then we're really not going to get it.
Maybe just add something on the Rios-Montt case. which is that my understanding is that it's not taking it back to zero, but it is taking it back to a point after much of the prosecution testimony was given. So it's in some ways a judicial setback, but the overall advance on the case, I think, marks a certain amount of progress, and also shows one of the forces against both telling the truth and the accountability. You know, we also didn't see a trial of U.S. involvement. We didn't see a trial of Lucas Garcia, who in some ways was even worse than Honduras Montes directly preceded him as a dictator in Guatemala. But you know, it is one advance of truth-telling that I think will never be forgotten. The testimony that the Shield people gave by either those people who gave it or those people who heard it, and that's part of our ongoing. It's not something that just ends. It's part of an ongoing process by which we attempt to reconcile and deal with the past.
On the last question was the issue of the signatures for coups in Latin America. We see this very clearly on several occasions. We saw it first being used against Hugo Chavez in 2002. Supposedly he had signed a letter of resignation. We saw it again with Aristide in 2004. Apparently he had signed a letter of resignation. And again with Zelaya in 2009 with the forces of the coup alleging that he signed a letter of resignation. This was all in many ways done because they were trying to seek both U.S. support, open U.S. endorsement and support, while at the same time seeking support within the various institutions within Latin America, because they know that according to the Letter of the Americas, which all the countries are signatories to, they cannot really affect a military coup, an undemocratic military coup, and expect to have recognition. So they found, or they tried to utilize, manipulate the so-called signature, which in all three cases proved to be a lie, proved to be false, simply in order to gain space, to gain time, and to try to gain legitimacy in an ever-changing context in which Latin American countries will not recognize a government that has been ousted by military means, that is undemocratic, that has attained the presidency through military over means. And that's precisely where they relied then on this notion of resignation, which in every case has been allowed.
Okay, so I think we've gone way into overtime, unless there's some very urgent questions. But feel free to talk with the panelists. I'd like to thank you very much for having come over here from the last events that we'll be getting back now. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I hope you go back to your offices, organizations, homes, and remain engaged on these issues. You know, feel free again to visit our webpage, www.cpr.net, but also, you know, you can get the contact information of the panelists here and get a better idea of the work that they're doing as well. So thank you all for coming.